young couple living in a large, isolated house had gone out to a dinner party one evening and left the babysitter in charge of their two children. The children had been put to bed, and the babysitter was watching television when the phone rang. She answered, but all she heard was a man laughing hysterically, and then a voice saying, "Have you checked the children?" Thinking it was one of those calls or a practical joke, she slammed down the receiver and turned the television sound up. A short time later, the phone rang again. As she picked it up, the unmistakable hysterical laughter came down the line. And the voice once again said, "Have you checked the children?" Getting rather frightened, she called the operator and was advised they would notify the police. And should he phone again? Could she keep him talking in order to give them time to trace the call and have him arrested? Minutes after she replaced the receiver, the phone rang again when the voice said, "Have you checked the children?" She tried to keep him talking. However, he must have guessed what she was trying to do, and he hung up. Only seconds later, the phone rang again. This time it was the operator who said, "Get out of the house straight away. The call is coming from inside your location." The babysitter dropped the phone in horror, and just then heard someone coming down the stairs. She quickly fled from the house, running straight into the arms of the police. They burst into the house and found a man brandishing a large, bloody butcher's knife. He had entered the home through an upstairs window, murdered both of the children, and was just about to do the same to the babysitter. Urban legends have been around for centuries. Typically, there's always partial truth to the stories, but they tend to become hyperbole as the tales get passed on to other people. In this narrative, the tragic elements became an anecdote that managed to seep into Hollywood and inspire countless horror films that have since formed into cult classics such as Halloween by John Carpenter and When a Stranger Calls by Fred Walton. As you will soon see, the reality that inspired this dark urban legend is much scarier than fiction. Janett Christman was born on March 21st, 1936. She was the oldest daughter of Charles and Lula Christman, with a younger sister by 18 months, Retta, and a newborn baby sister, Cheryl. The young family of 5 had been living in Boonville, Missouri, before relocating to the small college-oriented town of Columbia, Missouri. Known for its football team, Missouri Tigers. They were living on the upper floor of the business they owned, Ernie's Cafe and Steakhouse, where they made an honest and reputable living. Janett was 13 years old, an 8th grade student at Jefferson Junior High School. She was described as a loving church-going teenager who had a knack for playing the piano and the choir. Intelligent and independent for her age, working fervently for the things that she desired. On the brisk Saturday of March 18, 1950, there was a dance party being held that evening for students. Janett had been invited to go by several of her friends, but declined because she had plans to babysit. She would often babysit for 2 families that were very well acquainted with one another, the Romacks and the Muellers. On this evening, she was going to be tending to Ed and Ann Romack's 3-year-old son, Gregory, hoping this job would provide enough money for a burgundy-colored suit that she had been saving up for the upcoming Easter holiday. Dusk began to settle in, and around 7:30 p.m., Janett arrived at the Romacks' residence. The couple had recently moved to a rural and isolated home on 1015 Stewart Road, directly on the outskirts of Columbia. At the time, Anne was pregnant, and due to the recent and exhausting relocation, they hadn't been able to have a night out just for themselves in a long while. So when the chance arose to spend time with friends and play cards, they capitalized on the opportunity. When Janet arrived, Anne assured her that Gregory enjoyed sleeping with the radio on, and he shouldn't be much of a hassle. Prior to leaving, Ed quickly taught Janet how to load, unload, and fire the shotgun in case anything transpired. As they were leaving, Ed placed the gun near the front door and said they would be back soon. He advised her to lock the door and turn the front porch light on if anyone came knocking. With that, they departed in good spirits and went on about their night. Throughout the evening, the weather began to worsen. The temperature dwindled down to the mid-20s with a storm bringing in the rain and sleet. The robust wind swayed the nearby trees and echoed against the home. Despite the unexpected weather, there was no apparent cause for concern until about 10:35 p.m., when Boone County Sheriff's Department received a frantic phone call. And with the treacherous weather pouring in, the night for the local police had been going relatively slow. When the phone suddenly began ringing, Officer Ray McCowan picked up the receiver and asked what the emergency was. He was immediately met with the howls of a woman screaming in sheer panic, uttering the words, "Come quick." He tried intervening, but the phone line was cut short, and the dial tone was all that could be heard. McCowan knew straight away the horror emanating from the female caller's voice was genuine, and not just a prank by some doltish teenagers. But all he could do was anticipate the phone ringing again, because the call was just too short to provide a trace. And the woman didn't mention any additional information as to what was unfolding or her whereabouts. Shortly thereafter, Anne Romack called home from the Moon Valley Villa, where she, her husband, the Muellers, and other friends were, to check on Janet and see how the night with Gregory was going. But nobody answered the phone. Considering it was quite late, Anne wasn't too concerned, presuming Janet had fallen asleep. The Romacks continued to spend a few extra hours away before heading home at approximately 1:15 a.m. It was 1:35 a.m. approximately when the Romacks pulled into their driveway that was filled with rain and seeping mud. They noticed the porch light was on, which alerted them, and the front window blinds were wide open. As Ed began to fiddle with his keys to unlock the front door, he realized that it was already unlocked. He was perplexed because of his instructions to Janet before leaving. And as he and Anne walked through the front door, they were met with a ghastly discovery. 3 days shy of her 14th birthday, Janett Christman was found sprawled out on the living room floor, in a pool of blood soaking through the shagged carpet. She had been violently assaulted and murdered. She was sprawled about with her right slipper barely hanging on her foot. There was a head wound from a blunt instrument, multiple puncture wounds from a mechanical pencil, and other things which I will leave out. A few feet away was the landline phone dangling off the hook, the reason why Anne was unable to get the response when she called earlier that evening. The sight of this horrifying scene sent Anne into a hectic state as she darted up the stairs to check on her 3-year-old son, Greg, who had thankfully been unharmed and shockingly still asleep, oblivious to the horror awaiting downstairs. Ed Romack hastily dialed the police, and they were dispatched immediately. Sheriff Glenn Powell from Boone County Sheriff Department arrived with numerous detectives and bloodhounds. Unfortunate complications soon arose, however, when Lieutenant Joe Douglas from the city police, a different jurisdiction that hadn't any authority since the Romacks lived 100 yards out of the city limits, arrived at the scene and attempted to take reign of the investigation. The battle of leadership had the separate agencies being uncooperative with one another. And though answers unraveled quickly, there were many disagreements amongst the two groups. Inside of the home were clear indications Janet had resisted her attacker. Blood smears and fingerprints were found in the living room and kitchen, where the back door had been unlocked and left ajar. As the police followed the trail outside, the search dogs managed to track the assailant's scent 1 mile up from Stewart's Road to West Boulevard and across West Ash Street before losing the trail. Back at the crime scene, an adult male's footprints were found near a side window of the residence that had been shattered with a garden hoe. Where several authorities believe the perpetrator had gained entry, primarily due to muddy papers found on the piano that was situated nearby. The method of entry is where the two jurisdictions collided. Due to Ed's instructions that he gave Janett, many detectives suspected that the perpetrator knew Janett and tried appearing friendly to get inside. This theory was substantiated by the front porch light being on, as he had told Janett to do so if anyone came to the door, and the loaded shotgun nearby untouched. And the apparent knowledge as to where to locate the electric iron to use the cord for a murder weapon. With this prevailing theory, law enforcement worked 12-hour shifts tirelessly, performing stakeouts and canvassing surrounding areas under the suspicion that the killer might return to the scene to relish in what he had accomplished. Likewise, the police sought assistance from the public, asking for locals to call in if they saw anything peculiar or anyone acting differently than normal. Meanwhile, local officers had gone around questioning Janett's friends, family, and students from her school. During this process, along with local residents phoning in possible leads, potential suspects were formed. However, it quickly became evident that a racial bias was present because the majority of the men brought in for questioning were black men in the community, who were unwarrantedly deemed suspicious. Nevertheless, this tactic was fruitless and the police were no closer to resolving Janett's murder. As the police continued on with their investigation into Janett Christman's murder, one prime suspect named Robert Mueller materialized, and the circumstantial evidence against him began piling up heavily. Mueller was 27 years old and friends with Ed Romack since high school. After graduation, Mueller served in World War II as an Army Air Corps captain and had a distinguishable record. He later returned to Columbia, Missouri, overlooking his father's restaurant, Mueller's Virginia Cafe, and working as a tailor. Many people remember him for dressing well and always carrying around a mechanical pencil in his front shirt or jacket pocket. When Mueller and Ed Romack reacquainted, they shared mutual friends and would frequently spend time together. According to Ed, he had a lustful eye for virgin women and spoke about having a desire to defile someone young. Moreover, he knew Janett since she babysat for him on numerous occasions. And Ed recalled him making lecherous comments about her well-developed hips and breast. Additionally, Mueller's lewd behavior stemmed over to Ed's wife, Anne, who felt uncomfortable around him because of his uninvited sexual advancements. Much to her dismay, one day before Janett's murder, Mueller had been visiting the home, helping Anne hem a dress, and reportedly tried groping her breast. In a formal statement given to police, Anne described Mueller as a man who doesn't use words, he uses his hands. The oddities didn't end there, however. The morning of Janett's death, Robert contacted Janett to ask if she could babysit his children for the night. But she declined because she already had prearrangements to look after the Romack's son. Furthermore, Mueller attended the gathering with the Romacks and their mutual friends. But hours into the party, he excused himself, claiming that he had to meet a doctor who was meant to tend his son. Mueller disappeared for 2 hours before returning to the party. The police questioned Mueller's doctor and discovered that he never went to the Mueller residence that evening. To implicate Robert even further, Ed Romack got a phone call from Mueller at his father's home on the morning after the murder. Supposedly, he had asked if he needed any assistance with cleaning up the blood throughout the house. And this shook Ed to his core, because Mueller shouldn't have known about the tragedy that took place because the crime hadn't even been printed in the local newspaper yet. Additionally, Ed claimed Mueller would later speak to him regarding the crime and began expounding on how he believed that the crime unfolded, claiming that breaking a window to climb into the home would be too loud and noticeable. Instead, he said, it would be much easier to knock on the door and say, "Ed sent me here to get poker chips." The circumstantial evidence against Mueller was staggering and overwhelming. In May 1950, law enforcement compiled all the evidence against him and went to his residence to speak with him. Rather than following the basic guidelines of an arrest warrant and interview procedure, the officers didn't take him into custody. Rather, they transported him to a farmhouse outside of city limits and interrogated him at length throughout the course of the night. Mueller was subsequently taken to the state capital, Jefferson City, where he was given a polygraph test and unfortunately passed. With the unfortunate results of the lie detector tests, the detectives had to let Mueller go. However, all of the evidence pointed in his direction, and the court judge, W.M. Denwindle, felt compelled to arrange a grand jury to investigate Mueller's case further. Over time and legal issues, Robert Mueller was never charged because of the profound level of incompetence that police conducted during their investigation into him. These intertwined factors led Mueller to not be apprehended, and he later sued the police department, but he lost the lawsuit. Afterward, he relocated his family to Tucson, Arizona, and in 2006, he passed away at the age of 83 years old. It's now been 68 years, and the once loving, hardworking, and independent 13-year-old who was saving up with a burgundy dress for Easter would have been 82 years old on March 21st of 2018. While the Romacks and the Christman family believed highly that Robert Mueller is responsible for Janett's murder, they were painfully stricken with the unsatisfaction for receiving legal justice and closure, and the case officially remains unsolved.